Now we'll be talking about setting a national productivity growth agenda, still at the Nigerian Economic Summit 2025, that's NEST 31. And we're joined by the co-founder, Truva Intelligence, Basil Abia, who will now be speaking to us about that. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Olive. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you as well. So when we talk about the national productivity agenda, what would you say the core drivers should be?
Well, that's a very direct question, but it has to start with some context.
Okay.
First and foremost, what is the context of productivity right now in Nigeria? How do we measure it? And in our studies, the work that I've done over the last 2 years, especially with foreign direct investment, mostly you look at total factor productivity as well as other forms. And for TPA, for instance, we don't do that recording quite a lot. The MBS is supposed to be doing frequent recordings of TPAs and other indicators for that. And so since you cannot measure, how are you able to improve? How are you able to even identify the drivers, right?
Right.
But segueing to your question, which is, like I mentioned, is very direct. For us, on the side of the private sector and intelligence in that sense, providing data evidence to policymakers and business decision makers, we need to be able to look at productivity yields in agriculture. For me, that would be the key driver. I've done a number of projects in food security this year alone. For instance, we've been covering 6 value chain crops since January across 7 states in Nigeria. And one of the things that we have not really liked about our findings is just how poor the output for production is compared to our African peers. So we're not even trying to compare ourselves to China or ourselves to the grain basket of, you should say, Ukraine or Russia. We're comparing ourselves to Mali, to Ghana, to Niger, and to Cameroon. Like? The current picture is really bleak. I can give you some numbers. Okay. We, on average, we do about 2,000 metric tons, 2,000 kilograms per hectare, sorry, in output when it comes to tomato on average. The African average is high. The African average is around 13,000 kilograms per hectare. So you can see, for instance, this again is a driver that we need to change, and we need to be able to measure accurately. I'm using numbers from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. While I would continue to love using those numbers, I want to see our NBS record these numbers as well.
May I ask why the NBS isn't recording these numbers?
Funding and capacity issues. Don't get me wrong, I think if I'm to rate Nigerian agencies, NBS will still be top of the rate in that sense. They do the best that they can. Dr. Yemi Kale, who was the former Director General and CEO, was fantastic. He did the best that he could. The new leadership, not as good, but they're still doing the best that they can. I think they botched their rebasing exercise. There was poor communication in a lot of sense, and also they had methodology issues, which all of us in the research space highlighted. But outside of that, I rate the NBS quite high, right, compared to other agencies. However, I can point to the challenges, and financing from the federal government of Nigeria has not been good. Secondly, capacity building too has not been good. In fact, most of the capacity building comes from external bodies like the World Bank providing support, for instance, and the UNDP providing support. We cannot continue depending on multilateral institutions to support a very important part of our decision-making process, which is how we record our statistics, how we measure our productivity. And so that first driver, like I mentioned, is our food yield or food productivity yield in that sense. And it's very poor compared to our African peers, so we need to be able to scale that. Another driver that it will be very important is human capital index. And it's just a measurement for the quality of education, the quality of skills that your labor force has. Outside of your labor force as well, the quality of education and skills or potential skills that your younger generations have, your youths have, I just came back from Germany, and I remember talking to a few youngsters, German youngsters, 16, 17, 18-year-old kids already having work experience, doing internships or going to stores and learning inventory stuff. Don't get me wrong, we do that in Nigeria as well, but it's very informal, right? They have a very formal way of doing that. So that's what I'm trying to see. A key driver is if we're able to formalize that. 58% of Nigeria's GDP is the size of our informal economy, one of the largest informal economy sizes in the world. It has its own challenges with that number. I think the key challenge is how do you try to incorporate them to the national economy? How are you to the formal economy? Sorry. How are you able to measure activity happening in the informal economy? Now, the MBS did try, but it didn't work. So, just answering your question with those two drivers, I can now add and say one of my suggestions, and I'm going to make that suggestion tomorrow again when we're doing the National Productivity Agenda session, is that we can start to look at novel ways of measuring productivity, like very easy things like geospatial light. You know, now there are tools with which you're able to see geospatial activity, geospatial data. You can look at Lagos, you can look at Abuja and compare. You can compare with places like Uyo or Kano, for instance, just by looking at nighttime light frequency, you know. And that's how you're able to measure, oh, we need to be able to increase productivity in this part of Nigeria vis-a-vis this other part of Nigeria, just using that. Thanks to mobile phone penetration, which is one of the highest rates, not only in Africa, but in the world. We're able to also use indicators around that mobile telephony. So how many people actively use phones. I've read research papers by macroeconomists in Latin America where they were using WhatsApp activity as an indicator for productivity. So there are many ways to be able to do that. And again, back to the research literature in economics. This is not to say that the story is completely bleak for Nigeria. On the continent and in the sub-region, I just read a paper by a macroeconomist at the Central Bank of the Gambia, Alfosine Toure, and he highlighted that Nigeria has the highest total factor productivity rate for the sub-region, you know, mostly because we make maximal use of our means of production compared to other parts of West Africa. Now, that can be a good thing, but that can also be a bad thing because, again, like they say, the one-eyed is actually the king in the land of the blind, right? So, unfortunately, I think in the context of Nigeria, this metaphor is perfect for Nigeria. We're the one-eyed in the land of the blind, in all honesty. We need to be able to scale those levels. So I preferred some solutions in that sense of how to improve measurement, which is basically increasing financing from the federal government coffers. I do not think it makes a lot of sense for MBS to be depending solely on multilateral organizations and INGOs. We're vulnerable like that. And we've seen with the President Trump policy of getting off a number of U.S. Department of State financing to African countries, cutting them off, has made our development space very vulnerable. It has also made our public health sector quite vulnerable. So it's time for not only our federal government, but also the state governments to also set up competent Bureau of Statistics. I remember 2 years ago, I was in conversations with Katsina State government to set up one for them. Unfortunately, they paused their conversation in that regard. And I don't blame them, maybe lack of financing, I do not know. But there are many private sector players like Truva Intelligence and many other companies. Even the NESG, they have the capacity to help state governments, local governments even, build their own Bureau of Statistics, their Department of Statistics, improve how they measure productivity. Because again, like I said, you can only improve what you can measure. And unfortunately right now, we're not measuring well, we're not measuring frequently, we're not measuring within the context of our economy.
So we don't have, is it safe to say that we don't have a clear picture as to why we have abysmally low numbers when you compare to our African counterparts?
Yes, we don't have clear numbers. We do not really have, like I mentioned, probably the easiest number to use to look at productivity right now is agricultural yields. And the agricultural yields data is from FAO. It's not even from like the MBS. MBS would give you their labor productivity statistics. They will also give you their TPA, unfortunately TPA and even their labor statistics data, they come in infrequently. They're not as frequent as possible. Okay. And they have methodology issues to
so
date.
Why would we not have actual numbers to give us the data and help prefer solutions? I'm sure we also know what the causes. We can't say.
Yes, of course. Of course, we know the causes.
To what some of the causes are.
The causes are, I think, almost every Nigerian knows. Electricity, for instance, is very poor. I'm sorry to say it, but an economy of our size cannot be depending on 5,800 megawatts of electricity from the national grid. It's that bad that off-grid off-grid numbers are around 40,000 megawatts, you know, if you look at all the informal sources and the formal sources as well. All of our biggest industrialists, they self-generate. You know, the other day, Aliko Dangote mentioned that he had a capacity of 1,500 megawatts for all of his facilities, including his refinery, and then of all his cement factories. I'm sure that's a similar situation with Bois. In fact, not that I'm sure, it is a similar situation with Bois. You know, they have their own self-generating plants as well. And then, of course, non-grid improvements as well. So again, this is not to say that off-grid and non-grid electricity supply isn't welcome. It is welcome. We need that. Other energy economies have that. But when your national grid is 5,800 megawatts, it's simply, you can't scale with that number. So the major causality of our low productivity is our poor energy. And when I say energy, I'm not only covering electricity, even cooking, for instance. You know, our cooking fuels are not effective. They are very injurious to our health. So just imagine, for instance, being an industrial cook, a woman in north central Nigeria. She can't go as far as 30 years in that business, because at some point she's going to either be blind or visually affected because of the effect of poor fuel. There's also an efficiency issue in like the number of plates that she's churning out. She can churn out faster when she uses an electric plate. Now I'm using my own personal example with living, well, not living, but I spent at least a week in Germany. And I remember not even having to use an LPG cooker. It was just an electric plate. It was so easy. It was fast. You know, I had absolutely no smoke coming into my eyes. Now imagine that effect for an industrial cook or a woman who does commercial cooking in north central Nigeria. So all of these outcomes, they're very easy to relate with the average Nigerian. And I can say the causality, the core causality of Nigeria's poor productivity is our poor energy. Right. And if we improve that, then you see productivity increase. It's very easy. It's the basic classical economic principle. The more energy that you consume and you produce as well, the more productive your economy is.
It has a ripple effect, really, even when we talk about post-harvest loss.
Yes.
There's so many areas to look at. I'm sure that we can expand further on that when we have another conversation tomorrow. Yeah. But let's talk about the small business owners, the informal sector. How can we bring them into this conversation about productivity?
Again, I'm sorry, but the truth is, it's still energy.
Yes.
It's still energy. Like, think of the potential economic losses that a barber is incurring just because he has to depend on his generator set to cut hair, you know, for men. And also think of the cost, the price transmission. An average young Nigerian who's listening to me right now knows that when you go to certain barber stores, especially the small ones, when they put on the gen, the price is different from when it is from, well, we no longer say NEPA now. So if you're based in the suburbs of Abuja, AEDC. So they'll tell you the price is different. And of course, we now know why the price is different, right? The cost of fueling, especially with the removal of subsidy and all of that. So just do the quick thinking of what it means to have 24 hours electricity for that barber. He now has the offset to be able to even hire an additional staff. He can do more training. His earnings improve. Before you know it, he's expanding. You know, now replicate that with the entirety of the informal economy, in the formal sector, which is about 58% of our GDP. That is just the first order effects, the second order effects, and the third order effects. It's incredible. It's incredible for employment. It's incredible for labor upskilling. I just got a paper published by the Free Trade Review, and the paper is basically talking about Chinese foreign direct investment and the impact in African economies. In the long run, any type of foreign direct investment, which comes, of course, with lots of energy in that sense, because the Chinese are not going to come and do FDI without electricity.
Right.
In the long run, it improves labor productivity. And what is labor productivity? It's just how much output, you know, efficiency that the workers can put per hour or per minute. And this is exactly what we want for our country. So energy, to answer your question, energy availability and affordability, as well as reliability, is going to fix that problem.
I hear you speak about a number of suggestions. You speak about energy, energy affordability, energy generation, reliability distribution. And then I heard you speak earlier about funding the NBS and ensuring that we track our own data here. We start maybe to have state-sponsored Bureau of Statistics. But if there was one reform that you could pick, the one leading reform that you want to see by 2030? I know there are many, but you have to choose one.
Olive, I want light too. I really want light. I want electricity. Sorry to cut into that Nigerian colloquial, but electricity availability and affordability, we need to expand. I'm really surprised that in the last close to 3 years now of this presidency, we haven't seen a lot of activity in terms of improving electricity generation. Again, I know that reforms take a while, but come on, if you're doing preferential order, in economics we're taught of preferential order, right? We're taught of opportunity cost. If you're doing it, the most important opportunity cost here, I think, is spending those monies on electricity generation. I see no reason why we're spending those monies, a bulk of it, on the coastal highway. Yes, I would take expending all of that resources really on improving the number. In fact, just paying off the debt. We owe Gencos and that entire value chain over to close to $3 billion, US dollars in debt. We need to pay off that debt. In fact, paying off that debt alone allows for more liquidity for these Gencos to even improve their own capacity. Not to talk of you spending your own monies and doing what similar thing to that President Olusegun Obasanjo did, which was fraught in a lot of corruption, by the way. But President Olusegun Obasanjo, at some point, spent quite a lot of money, especially towards his last tenure, last term of 4 years, spent a lot of money on critical infrastructure, especially generating plants. A number of these generating plants are some of the highest producers of electricity that we have for the grid. So we should do that, and there's still opportunity. So if anyone wants to listen to me and pay attention to some of my insights, I'd say fix electricity problem by improving generation, by improving the industry governance, by also improving transmission, because you can't talk about generation without transmission. Our transmission infrastructure is obsolete. As I speak to you, our transmission infrastructure cannot convey more than 6,000 megawatts of electricity. It's one of the reasons why our grid always collapses, and we should not be having grid collapses at this age.
Well, I don't know what the projection for our electricity, our energy generation, distribution, affordability, and consistency is. We've just seen that the Minister of Power has declared intention to run for governorship at the next election. So, again, I hope that the government is listening and that a number of these suggestions can be adhered to, and we move from just talk to actual implementation. Basil Abia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Olive. Always a pleasure to be on News Central.
All right.
Thank you.
Here, still bringing you the conversations that matter. Stick with us here at News Central, live at the Nigerian Economic Summit 2025.